Of all the bands to come and go from Southern California's punk and skateboarding scenes of the 80s, there's a particular band that sticks out as one of, if not the most beloved cult favorite of both audiences from that generation. And while some of that definitely had to do with their songs popping up on many a comp and skate video, the record housing those fan favorite tracks is where it all really begins. Fan favorites, might I add, of not just your average Joe, Jenny, or Jace with a Powell deck and a few Black Flag records, but a number of both scenes' most noteworthy names.
And if you ask me, a record that's been handpicked by so many of punk and skateboarding's favorite people is one more than worth the attention of the broader audience. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today we are here to discuss one of Southern California's most impactful cult favorite releases, Agent Orange's Living in Darkness. Of course, with some added trivia and some of my personal thoughts on this record along the way. But before we do that, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, then may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways!
After getting their start in Placentia, California in the year 1979, Agent Orange would quickly find themselves on an upward-moving trend in California that blended the relentless energy of punk with the non-stop grooves of surf rock. One that prior to their debut was most notably performed by San Francisco's Dead Kennedys on some of their more rhythm-heavy tunes like California Uber Alice, Police Truck, and of course, Holiday in Cambodia. And after discovering they weren't the only Californians with a knack for writing punk music one could dance to just as easily as they could mosh, Agent Orange would put their own spin on that sound under the year-round sunshine of Orange County, where more people actually knew how to surf. A sound they would quickly find went over just as well, if not even better, with people who knew how to skate after they issued their debut 7-inch in 1980. And this of course appointed them cult favorite status in their local circles and would later prompt them to become one of the OGs in band skateboard production via a still-lasting agreement with Vision Streetwear, who've been slapping their name on boards in their music and skate videos since the early 80s. Boards, mind you, that have been hanging on many a skater's wall for all those years, because I know you're not scratching up that totally sick graphic you paid $4,000 for.
But alas, Agent Orange's local popularity and promising debut proved to be impressive enough to grab the attention of Hollywood, California's Posh Boy Records. And after doing so, the band hit the studio at Brian Elliott Recording, also in Hollywood, in the fall of 1981. A name that, if you're watching this video, you probably wouldn't recognize, but belonged to the guy who later wrote Madonna's hit single Papa Don't Preach in 1986, and just so happened to own the studio.
He wouldn't oversee the production for Living in Darkness, though, and instead Agent Orange worked alongside their friend Daniel Van Patten, who'd also handled production duties on their debut 7-inch the year before. And the sessions at Brian Elliott's resulted in an 8-song release that melted faces all over Southern California and more, with its ability to groove just as hard as it slams. And once it debuted in November of 1981, people really couldn't get enough of this album, and I mean could not get enough of it. Because by the time its 10th anniversary rolled around, it had already stayed in such heavy rotation that the band decided to reissue it in 1992 with 7 additional tracks from some of their EP releases, one of which was the original version of the fan favorite Bloodstains from their first 7-inch, a recording to feature the much-loved and tragically departed Adolescence bassist Steve Soto that was done before he left Agent Orange at the end of 1979 for the Adolescents.
The record kicks in the door with the washy 2-minute banger Too Young to Die, one that features just enough noodly guitar playing from Mike Palm, backed by a groovy rhythm section in Scott Miller and James Levesque, to set the stage for the kind of instrumentation that this album is all about.
Of course, along with a few shouts from Mike about how not just he, but we're all too young to die. A statement that has aged very well considering Agent Orange has relentlessly kept chugging along in the 43 years since this album came out. But its second track, Everything Turns Gray, is where things really start to pick up speed, diving back into the surf with a couple of runs down a descending guitar pattern before we're dished out one of the world's first tastes of the iconic octave guitar lead over a tight rhythm section in a punk song. A writing technique that would prove to be such a smash hit in the scene that nearly every punk band from Orange County to Japan since has had at least a half-dozen songs in their repertoire where the lead guitarist jams out on their A and G strings. Not to mention the time Lagwagon put their own spin on turning everything gray in 1998 on their 5th full-length record, Let's Talk About Feelings. But a few gnarly guitar parts alone aren't going to make a tune as as timeless as this one's proved to be. That's usually the chorus's job. And Mike and James made sure to write one we'd never forget, with lyrics just as catchy as the melody, and a simple reminder that no matter what they do or say, everything turns gray.
We're then gifted with a deliciously distorted rendition of Dick Dale's Miserlow before the album rounds out its A-side with an opportunity to shout the last goodbye.
One that the band does ever so gracefully over a few of everyone's favorite minor chords and a tastefully accented drum groove fluctuating between the ride and crash cymbals. And then just to shake things up a bit as the record reaches its halfway point, Agent Orange tosses us a sharp instrumental bridge. And a bridge that speaks a little more to their punk side than their surf one, just enough to get the mosh pit thrashing harder before closing out the first half of the album with a reprise to this song's signature 3-chord progression.
And then we land on the B-side, opening up with the crowd pleaser and my personal favorite Agent Orange track, No Such Thing.
A tune that leans a little heavier on its instrumental side, picking up where Everything Turns Gray left off with another spiky little guitar riff to build along the rhythm section before jumping back into the surf groove. And No Such Thing likes to do a little bit of shape shifting throughout its different sections, structuring its verses around heavy guitar chugs complemented by a bouncy bass line from James Levesque that utilizes both the high and low ends to carry the rhythm. Another, albeit a little more discreet, showcase of something that would prove to be very trendy amongst the next generation of punk bands.
But all this groove takes a brief pause, just long enough to nail a perfect Burt slide, before the instrumentation reinvents itself for another banger chorus.
One that strips things down to the tried and true combo of loosely strummed chords over smooth surf rock drums to spotlight the call and response vocals. And after a second run through the verse and chorus, the instrumental takes yet another turn into Living in Darkness's first guitar solo, setting the stage with a brief reprise to the sharp intro riff and build up into some melodic noodling on the low end of the A minor scale.
The record then shifts our attention with a few dark chords and cymbal hits in the name of A Cry for Help in a World Gone Mad. A slightly more ambitious track that pushes the lead vocals up to the front, but of course is still backed by a steady groove you could sway back and forth to just as easily as you could board slide a car stopper.
And like a lot of vocally driven tunes, this is one that delves into some slightly more emotional subject matter. And I guess you could call this one Agent Orange's alternative to a slow song, as it certainly puts on a darker tone, but holds a similar steady tempo to the rest of the track listing. Despite its relaxed vibe, A Cry for Help in a World Gone Mad also includes the album's second guitar solo, though this time through a more reserved approach with some pentatonic bends to spice things up just enough before the final chorus. And while it maybe isn't the most famous one of these tunes these days, this song would also be the soundtrack to Agent Orange's first music video, which very appropriately is a clip featuring some killer bull skating shots during most of its instrumental sections, and the band performing at different places of the skate park during the verses and choruses.
Then in the 7th and second to last slot, we of course have the cult classic Bloodstains, a brilliantly written masterpiece that could easily be played forever if you felt like doing so, as it starts exactly how it stops.
Slapping the listener in the face with a tightly arranged chord progression downpicked ever so eloquently by Mike's right palm, before he proceeds to tell us all about how they can make things worse for him and sometimes he'd rather die. And the verse to feature that iconic line punches along until the band opens things up with another tasty surf groove to get you pumping in the bowl just long enough to 50-50 the coping before that familiar chug between the F sharp and G returns for your ride back down. Halfway through the track, Scott Miller then graces us with a little more hang time on the surf groove so Mike can rip into his third guitar solo of the album, one in which he proudly wears his Dick Dale influence on his sleeve throughout 2 positions of the harmonic minor scale before he and the rest of the band drive things home with a final chorus. And the first time I spent a whole song thinking about cheap thrills, fast cars, rich girls, and fine wine, I certainly lost my sense control and mine too. And so did everyone else, because Bloodstains has been covered to death by punk bands big and small ever since it debuted on that 1987-inch.
Then finally, the album comes to a close with its 8th and title track, Living in Darkness. And despite starting out slow and featuring the only clean guitars on the entire album, picks up into an all-too effective send-off full of that groovy, punchy energy the record proudly maintained for most of its run.
Written around another buzzy power chord progression and a few key hits in the chorus emphasized by claps that'll easily get the whole crowd following in step the next time Agent Orange is in town. And clocking in at 4 minutes and 12 seconds, Living in Darkness also holds the title of the album's longest track by nearly a minute and a half, which is all too appropriate when you consider that this is the track in which Mike chooses to tell us he'd like to live to be a couple thousand years old. But even though it's a little longer than the rest, I certainly didn't feel any older after the last time I listened to it, and if anything, I feel young enough to be slightly less nervous about the next time I decide to drop in. And I think that's got at least something to do with the double stop guitar solo that kicks in about halfway through the track. A few punchy lead licks we actually get a second helping of in between the final chorus and chunky ending, overall resulting in a pretty genre-defining release for its time, and one that is still showing its impact through the writing of punk bands to this day. And if you're someone who likes Agent Orange and bands that also like Agent Orange, then do yourself a favor and check out Seattle, Washington's MFD and their 2024 EP, Boom.
Well, I think that about does it for our little history lesson here on Living in Darkness. And I gotta say, I think this record holds up exceptionally well for one that's nearly 45 years old. But that's enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What's your favorite track from this album? When and where was the first time and place you heard it? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.